The morning I found Whiskers convulsing on my kitchen floor, I knew my life was about to change forever. But I never could have imagined that the woman I'd been trying so hard to please for 3 years would be the one holding the poison. What happened next turned a quiet Tuesday in suburban Phoenix into a day that would echo through courtrooms, family dinners, and my own heart for years to come. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people closest to you can be the most dangerous, and how justice, when it finally comes, sounds exactly like the screams of someone who thought they'd never get caught.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Nina Thomas had always been the type of person who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. At 26, she possessed that particular blend of optimism and determination that comes from growing up in a loving family where conflicts were resolved with conversation, not warfare. Her apartment in Tempe, Arizona, reflected this gentle nature. Soft throw pillows in sage green scattered across a cream-colored couch, plants thriving in every available patch of sunlight, and photographs covering nearly every surface, capturing moments of joy with friends, family, and her beloved orange tabby cat, Whiskers. The apartment itself was nothing fancy, a second-floor unit in a complex built sometime in the 80s, with thin walls and a temperamental air conditioning unit that Nina had learned to coax back to life with a firm tap on its side panel. But it was hers, the first place she'd ever lived completely on her own, and she'd poured her heart into making it feel like home. The kitchen, though small, was her pride and joy. She'd installed a small herb garden on the windowsill, learned to make her grandmother's marinara sauce from scratch, and had even mastered the art of homemade bread during the pandemic lockdowns. Whiskers had been her constant companion for the past 4 years, ever since she'd found him as a scrawny kitten behind the veterinary clinic where she worked as a receptionist. He'd been barely 8 weeks old, all bones and attitude, hissing at anyone who came near his cardboard box shelter. But Nina had patience, and she'd spent her lunch breaks for 2 weeks straight, sitting quietly near his hiding spot, leaving small offerings of tuna and speaking to him in the gentle, sing-song voice that seemed to calm even the most anxious animals at the clinic. Working at Desert Valley Veterinary Clinic suited Nina perfectly. She genuinely cared about the animals and their families, remembering the names of regular patients and always having a kind word for anxious pet parents. Dr. Martinez, the clinic's owner, often said that Nina had a gift for making people feel heard and understood, even during the most stressful moments. It was at her friend Sarah's birthday party, 18 months earlier, that Nina had met Marcus Williams. He was 28, worked in construction management, and had the kind of easy smile that made conversation feel natural from the very first moment. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, wandering from the party to Sarah's back patio to a late-night diner where they'd shared pie and talked about everything from their favorite books to their worst jobs to their dreams for the future. Their relationship had unfolded naturally, without drama or games. Marcus was straightforward and honest, qualities that Nina treasured after a string of relationships with men who seemed to specialize in mixed signals and emotional unavailability. By their 6-month anniversary, Marcus was spending most nights at Nina's place, and they'd begun talking seriously about moving in together. The only shadow in their otherwise sunny relationship was Marcus's mother, Eleanor Williams. Eleanor was 62 years old, recently widowed, and had very strong opinions about nearly everything, especially her son's romantic choices. She lived alone in the large family home in North Phoenix, where Marcus had grown up, a sprawling ranch-style house with a meticulously maintained yard and enough space for all 3 of her adult children and their eventual families. From Nina's first meeting with Eleanor at a Sunday family dinner, it was clear that she fell short of whatever standards Eleanor had set for her middle son's girlfriend. The criticism was never direct. Eleanor was far too socially sophisticated for outright rudeness, but it was persistent and unmistakable. Nina's clothes were always somehow inappropriate, either too casual or too formal for the occasion. Her job was sweet, but not very ambitious. Her apartment was cozy in a tone that clearly meant inadequate. Marcus seemed oblivious to his mother's subtle disapproval, or perhaps he'd simply grown so accustomed to Eleanor's particular brand of passive criticism that it no longer registered. When Nina tried to discuss it with him, he'd brush off her concerns with assurances that his mother was just protective and that she'd warm up once she got to know Nina better.
But 18 months in, Eleanor showed no signs of warming up. If anything, her disapproval had become more pointed as it became clear that Nina and Marcus's relationship was serious. Eleanor had begun dropping hints about other young women, daughters of friends, former classmates of Marcus's, accomplished professionals who would be such a good match for her son. The comments about Whiskers had started about 6 months into Nina and Marcus's relationship. Eleanor claimed to be allergic to cats, though Nina had noticed she only seemed to develop symptoms when she was particularly annoyed. She'd make disparaging remarks about cat hair on Marcus's clothes, suggest that pets were expensive and impractical for young couples, and once memorably announced that she could never understand people who treat animals like children. Nina had tried everything she could think of to win Eleanor over. She'd researched Eleanor's interests and tried to engage her in conversations about gardening and classic movies. She'd offered to help with family gatherings, bringing carefully prepared dishes that Eleanor would taste with faint praise before setting aside. She'd bitten her tongue through countless dinner conversations where Eleanor would reminisce about Marcus's ex-girlfriends. The strain was beginning to show in small ways. Nina found herself dreading family gatherings, making excuses when possible and enduring them when necessary. She'd started second-guessing herself constantly. Was her dress too short? Her laugh too loud? Her opinions too firmly stated? She was losing weight from stress, something her coworkers at the clinic had begun to notice and comment on with concern. Despite everything, Nina remained determined to find a relationship with Eleanor. She genuinely believed that people were fundamentally good, that misunderstandings could be resolved through patience and communication, and that Eleanor's hostility stemmed from grief and protectiveness, rather than genuine malice. This belief in the possibility of redemption was both Nina's greatest strength and her most dangerous vulnerability. It was the quality that made her excellent at her job, beloved by her friends, and deeply cherished by Marcus. But it was also the blind spot that would nearly cost her everything she held dear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Tuesday morning started like any other, with Nina's alarm going off at 6:30 and Whiskers immediately appearing at her bedside, purring his breakfast demands. The Arizona summer had arrived with its typical vengeance, and even at dawn, the thermometer outside her kitchen window already read 87 degrees. Nina had learned to start her coffee maker the night before, timing it to finish brewing just as she stumbled into the kitchen, still half asleep and reaching for the largest mug she owned. But this morning felt different somehow. Heavier, like the air before a thunderstorm, though the weather forecast promised nothing but relentless sunshine for the next 10 days. Whiskers seemed restless too, pacing around his food bowl instead of immediately diving into his morning feast of salmon pate, his usual favorite. "What's wrong, buddy?" Nina asked, crouching down to scratch behind his ears. His fur felt slightly damp, unusual for a cat who is typically fastidious about grooming. When she lifted her hand, she noticed it trembled slightly. Odd, since she'd slept well and felt fine otherwise. The drive to work took her through her usual route down Mill Avenue, past the coffee shops already bustling with Arizona State University students despite the early hour. She'd grown to love this commute. The way the city gradually awakened around her, the familiar landmarks that marked her progression toward another day at the clinic. But today, even her favorite morning radio show couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her like an uncomfortable blanket. At Desert Valley Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Martinez was already in surgery with an elderly German shepherd who'd eaten something he shouldn't have. A common summer emergency, as pets sought relief from the heat by investigating anything that might provide entertainment.
Nina settled into her routine of checking the appointment schedule, returning voicemails from worried pet parents, and preparing charts for the day's patients. Around 10:30, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mom's making lunch for us today. Can you come by around noon? She's been asking about you." Nina stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decipher its meaning. Eleanor asking about her was usually not a good sign, typically preceding some new criticism or uncomfortable conversation about Nina's shortcomings as a potential daughter-in-law. But Marcus seeming genuinely pleased about the invitation. And Nina had been trying for months to find an opening, any opportunity to bridge the gap between herself and Eleanor. Maybe this was finally the chance she'd been hoping for. She texted back her acceptance, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. The morning dragged by with unusual slowness. Nina found herself checking the clock every few minutes, her normal efficiency replaced by a distracted restlessness that her coworkers noticed. Jessica, one of the veterinary technicians, asked twice if she was feeling okay, noting that Nina seemed jumpy and kept dropping things. At 11:30, Nina left work early, stopped by her apartment to check on Whiskers, who was napping peacefully in his favorite sunny spot by the window, and then drove the 20 minutes to Eleanor's house in North Phoenix. The Williams family home sat on a corner lot in an established neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house was worth at least 3 times what Nina could ever hope to afford on her clinic salary. Eleanor answered the door wearing what Nina had come to think of as her entertaining outfit, a pressed blouse in pale blue, dark slacks with a perfect crease, and small gold earrings that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother. Her gray hair was styled in the kind of precise waves that required a standing weekly appointment at an expensive salon, and her makeup was flawless despite the heat that was already climbing toward triple digits. "Nina, dear," Eleanor said, her smile as perfectly arranged as her appearance, "how lovely that you could make it on such short notice. I know how busy you are at that little clinic of yours." The comment stung, as it was meant to, but Nina had learned to let Eleanor's barbs roll off her. She'd brought flowers, daisies from the grocery store, nothing fancy, but cheerful and bright, and Eleanor accepted them with the kind of gracious politeness that somehow managed to convey that they were slightly tacky. Marcus was in the kitchen, assembling sandwiches with the focused concentration he brought to all his tasks. He looked up when Nina entered, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Hey, beautiful. Perfect timing. Mom made her famous chicken salad, and I was just cutting up some of those strawberries you brought over last week." The kitchen was Eleanor's domain, a showcase of granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and organization systems that would make a restaurant chef weep with envy. Every surface gleamed, every utensil had its designated place, and the refrigerator was covered with family photos arranged in precise rows. Pictures of Marcus and his brothers at various ages, holiday gatherings, graduations, and achievements. Nina had noticed months ago that there were no pictures of her anywhere in the house, not even casual snapshots from family dinners she'd attended. Lunch conversations started pleasantly enough. Eleanor asked about Nina's work, managing to sound genuinely interested even as she made subtle observations about the challenging nature of working with animals and their demanding owners. Nina found herself over-explaining her daily responsibilities as if she could somehow convince Eleanor that her job was meaningful and important through sheer enthusiasm. Marcus talked about his current project, a new shopping center being built in Chandler, his pride in the work evident in his detailed descriptions of the challenges they had overcome with the foundation and the timeline they were working to meet. Eleanor listened with the kind of focused attention she reserved for her son's accomplishments, asking intelligent questions and making encouraging comments. It was when they moved to the living room for iced tea and the peach cobbler Eleanor had made that morning that the conversation took a sharp turn toward more personal territory. "Nina, dear," Eleanor said, settling into her favorite chair with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested this was a planned moment, "Marcus tells me you're thinking about going back to school to become a veterinary technician." Nina nodded, surprised that Marcus had mentioned her career plans, but pleased that he thought to share something so important to her with his mother. "I've been saving up for the program at Phoenix College. Dr. Martinez thinks I'd be really good at it, and the clinic would probably hire me full-time once I graduate." "That's wonderful, dear," Eleanor said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. Of course, that's quite an investment of time and money. 2 years of school, isn't it? And you'd be, 28 by the time you finish?
The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Nina felt Marcus tense beside her on the couch, and she could see him preparing to defend her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. She was tired of having him fight her battles with his mother, tired of being the source of tension between them. 28 isn't exactly over the hill, Nina said with a smile that she hoped conveyed confidence rather than defensiveness. And I think it's important to keep growing and challenging yourself, no matter what age you are. Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Oh, of course, dear. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that, well, there are other considerations for young women your age, biological clocks and such. She paused delicately, as if the topic was too sensitive for direct discussion. Marcus has always wanted children, you know. He's wonderful with his nephew and niece. The room went completely silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning unit working overtime against the desert heat. Nina felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Marcus looked mortified, his jaw tight with an anger that Nina had rarely seen from him. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "That's really not—" "It's okay," Nina interrupted, though it absolutely wasn't. "Eleanor, I understand your concern about Marcus's future. I want those things too, a family, children, a stable life. But I also think two people can support each other's dreams and goals instead of seeing them as competing priorities." Eleanor's response was swift and surgical in its precision. "Of course, dear, though I do wonder sometimes if people who are so attached to their pets might have trouble making room for human relationships. I mean, that cat of yours, Whiskers, is it? Marcus tells me he's practically glued to your side. It's sweet, I suppose, but also a bit intense." The comment landed exactly where Eleanor had aimed it. Nina's relationship with Whiskers wasn't just about having a pet. It was about loyalty, unconditional love, and the kind of bond that had sustained her through some of the loneliest periods of her life. To have Eleanor reduce it to something unhealthy or excessive felt like a slap across the face. But before Nina could respond, Eleanor was already moving on, as if she'd made her point and was ready to change the subject. "More iced tea, anyone? I made it with fresh mint from the garden." The rest of the visit passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Nina managed to smile and nod through Eleanor's monologue about her garden, her volunteer work at the hospital auxiliary, and her plans to redecorate the guest bedroom that had belonged to Marcus's father. But inside, she felt something fundamental had shifted, some last vestige of hope that she and Eleanor might someday find common ground, finally withering under the Arizona sun. Marcus drove her back to her apartment in his truck, the air conditioning blasting but unable to cool the tension between them. He was furious with his mother in a way that Nina had never seen before, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I'm so sorry," he said as they pulled into her parking lot. "That was completely out of line, even for her. The thing about biological clocks and Whiskers, God, I don't even know where that came from." Nina leaned over to kiss his cheek, trying to reassure him even though her own emotions were still raw. "It's not your fault. She's grieving your father, adjusting to you boys being grown up and independent. Sometimes people say hurtful things when they're scared of losing what's important to them." But even as she said the words, Nina wasn't sure she believed them anymore. There had been something calculating in Eleanor's performance today, something that went beyond protective concern or adjustment anxiety. It felt like a declaration of war, delivered with such skill and subtlety that Nina couldn't even be sure she was the intended target. As Marcus's truck pulled away and Nina climbed the stairs to her apartment, she found herself thinking about elephants, how they could sense earthquakes and tsunamis long before humans detected any danger, their instincts tuned to vibrations too subtle for less sensitive creatures to perceive. Standing outside her door, fumbling for her keys in the oppressive heat, Nina wondered if she'd just experienced her own version of an earthquake warning, a tremor so slight that only someone paying very close attention would notice the ground shifting beneath their feet.
Inside her apartment, Whiskers greeted her with unusual enthusiasm, winding around her legs and purring loudly as if he had missed her terribly during the few hours she had been gone. She scooped him up, burying her face in his soft fur and breathing in his familiar scent, a mixture of sunshine and the lavender-scented fabric softener she used on his favorite blanket. "Just you and me, buddy," she whispered into his fur. "At least I know you're always on my side." She had no way of knowing that by tomorrow morning, even that certainty would be gone.
Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of brutal heat that made even longtime Phoenix residents question their life choices. By 7 a.m., the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees, and the weather app on Nina's phone cheerfully announced that the day would peak at 114, hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk, as the local news anchors loved to remind viewers during their breathless heat advisories. Nina had barely slept, tossing and turning through the night as her mind replayed every moment of yesterday's lunch with Eleanor. Each barbed comment seemed sharper in the darkness, each calculated pause more loaded with meaning. She'd finally given up on sleep around 5:30, padding to the kitchen to make coffee and finding Whiskers already awake, sitting by his empty food bowl with the patient expression of a cat who understood that his human was struggling but would wait as long as necessary for breakfast. The routine of feeding Whiskers and preparing for work usually grounded Nina, providing the structure she needed to face whatever challenges the day might bring. But this morning, even these familiar rituals felt off-kilter. Whiskers ate only half his food before wandering away, something he'd never done in the 4 years she'd known him. When she tried to coax him back to his bowl, he looked at her with eyes that seemed clouded and distant, as if he was seeing something she couldn't perceive. At the clinic, Nina threw herself into work with the kind of desperate energy that comes from needing distraction. She reorganized the supply closet, updated patient files that had been sitting in her when I have time pile for weeks, and volunteered to assist Dr. Martinez with a particularly complex surgery on a boxer who'd torn his ACL chasing a tennis ball. The physical demands of the work helped quiet her racing thoughts, at least temporarily. During her lunch break, Marcus called, his voice tight with an anger that had apparently simmered all night. "I confronted my mom this morning," he said without preamble, "about yesterday, about the things she said to you. I told her she was out of line and that she needs to apologize." Nina felt her stomach clench. She'd hoped that yesterday's confrontation might lead to some kind of resolution, but she'd also feared that pushing back against Eleanor might make things worse. "What did she say?" "She acted like she had no idea what I was talking about," Marcus replied, frustration evident in every word. "Said she was just expressing natural concern about our future, that any mother would ask the same questions. She made it sound like you were being oversensitive." The response was so perfectly Eleanor, deflecting responsibility while making Nina seem unreasonable for being hurt. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation delivered with the kind of practiced innocence that would make anyone questioning it seem petty or paranoid. "She did agree to have a conversation with you, to clear the air, as she put it. I know it's probably the last thing you want to do right now, but maybe if you two could just sit down together without me there to complicate things." Nina closed her eyes, leaning against the break room wall as the air conditioning unit hummed overhead. Every instinct she had was screaming that this was a trap, that Eleanor's idea of clearing the air would involve more subtle attacks disguised as maternal concern. But the hope in Marcus's voice was impossible to ignore, and Nina found herself agreeing to meet with Eleanor the following afternoon. The rest of Wednesday passed in a blur of routine tasks and mounting anxiety. Nina's coworkers at the clinic began commenting on her distracted state. She'd mixed up 2 patient files, forgotten to return 3 phone calls, and spent 20 minutes looking for her keys only to find them in her hand. Dr. Martinez finally pulled her aside around 4 o'clock. His dark eyes kind but concerned. "Nina, I don't know what's going on in your personal life, and you don't have to tell me, but you're not yourself today. Why don't you head home early, get some rest, spend some time with that cat of yours? Tomorrow's a new day." The drive home felt endless, traffic moving at a crawl as thousands of people fled their air-conditioned offices for the marginal relief of their air-conditioned cars and homes. Nina found herself gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force, her jaw clenched against the anxiety that had been building all day. She'd always prided herself on being able to handle difficult people and situations with grace. But Eleanor Williams was testing limits she didn't even know she had. Back at her apartment, Nina expected to find Whiskers in his usual afternoon spot, sprawled across the cool tiles of the bathroom floor, the coolest place in the apartment during the brutal summer months. Instead, she found him huddled under her bed, his breathing rapid and shallow. When she coaxed him out, her fur felt hot to the touch, and his normally bright orange coat seemed dull and lifeless. A cold spike of fear cut through Nina's anxiety about Eleanor. She'd worked at the veterinary clinic long enough to recognize the signs of serious illness in animals, and Whiskers was displaying several red flags. She scooped him up gently, wrapped him in a soft towel, and drove straight back to the clinic, calling Dr. Martinez from the car to explain the emergency. Dr. Martinez met her at the back entrance, his casual clothes suggesting he'd been at home when she called, but had immediately driven back to help. Together, they carried Whiskers into the examination room, where Dr. Martinez began a thorough assessment while Nina tried to control her breathing and think rationally about possible causes. "When did you first notice symptoms?" Dr. Martinez asked, his hands gentle but thorough as he examined Whiskers' eyes, mouth, and abdomen. "Maybe this morning or even yesterday," Nina replied, mentally cataloging the subtle changes she'd dismissed as stress or heat sensitivity. "He didn't finish his breakfast, seemed lethargic. I thought maybe he was picking up on my mood. You know how sensitive he is." Dr. Martinez nodded, continuing his examination. Whiskers submitted to the poking and prodding with unusual docility, another concerning sign. Normally, he was a cooperative patient, but alert and responsive to what was happening around him. Today, he seemed almost disconnected from his surroundings.
"I want to run some blood work," Dr. Martinez said finally. "His symptoms could indicate several different conditions, but I'm particularly concerned about his neurological responses. Has he been anywhere unusual recently? Eaten anything different? Been exposed to any new environments or people?" Nita started to shake her head, then stopped. "He was fine Monday night, normal Tuesday morning until I left for work. Yesterday was the first time I really noticed anything off. And today, he's been getting progressively worse." She paused, thinking through the timeline. "The only thing different has been I've been more stressed than usual. Family stuff with my boyfriend's mother." "Cats are incredibly sensitive to their owner's emotional states," Dr. Martinez agreed. "But this level of physical symptoms suggests something more than sympathetic stress response." The blood draw went smoothly, Whiskers barely reacting to the needle, another sign that worried Nina deeply. Dr. Martinez promised to rush the results and have preliminary findings within a few hours, but Nina knew from experience that rush in veterinary medicine still meant a long, anxious wait. She drove home with Whiskers wrapped in a soft blanket, his breathing slightly more regular but still concerning. Once back in her apartment, she settled him in his favorite sunny spot by the window, though he showed little interest in the warm patch of light that usually drew him like a magnet. Marcus arrived around 7:30 with Thai food and flowers, pink roses that he knew were her favorites, along with pad Thai from the restaurant where they'd had their first official date. His face was creased with worry, not just about the situation with his mother, but about Whiskers' sudden illness. "Dr. Martinez called me," he said, settling beside Nina on the couch where she was keeping vigil over the cat. "He said the preliminary blood work shows some abnormalities, but he wants to run more comprehensive tests tomorrow." Nina nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd been holding herself together through sheer willpower, but Marcus's presence and obvious concern threatened to crack the careful control she'd maintained all day. "This is all connected," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "Whiskers getting sick right after that lunch with your mother, right after she made those comments about him being too attached to me. It can't be a coincidence." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking Nina's hair with the absent tenderness of someone lost in thought. "You think my mother had something to do with Whiskers getting sick?" he asked, finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I don't know," Nina admitted. "But the timing is strange, and your mother made it pretty clear yesterday that she sees Whiskers as some kind of obstacle to our relationship. Plus, she's been in veterinary pharmaceutical sales for 30 years. She knows more about animal medications and their effects than most people." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice. The idea that Eleanor might have deliberately harmed Whiskers was almost too terrible to contemplate, but it also explained the nagging sense of unease that had been growing in Nina's mind since yesterday's lunch. "Tomorrow's meeting with her," Nina said finally. "I'm still going to go through with it, but I'm going to be asking some very direct questions, and I want you to know that whatever her answers are, this might change everything." Marcus nodded slowly, his arm tightening around Nina's shoulders. "Whatever happened, whatever we find out, we'll handle it together." "But Nina, if my mother hurt Whiskers, if she deliberately poisoned him?" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Nina heard the promise in his voice anyway. Outside, the temperature was finally beginning to drop as the sun set behind the mountains, but inside Nina's apartment, the air felt charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a devastating storm. Tomorrow's conversation with Eleanor would either provide innocent explanations for a series of unfortunate coincidences, or it would confirm Nina's worst fears about the woman she'd been trying so hard to win over.
Thursday morning brought no relief from the heat and no improvement in Whiskers' condition. If anything, he seemed worse. His breathing more labored, his eyes unfocused, and his usual morning routine completely abandoned. Nina had spent most of the night on the couch beside him, checking his pulse and monitoring his breathing, afraid that if she fell asleep, she might wake up to find him gone. At 6 a.m., she called the clinic and spoke directly to Dr. Martinez, who agreed to see Whiskers immediately. The drive across town felt surreal in the early morning light, the empty streets and shuttered businesses creating an apocalyptic atmosphere that matched Nina's growing sense of dread. Dr. Martinez was waiting when she arrived, already dressed in scrubs and moving with the focused urgency that Nina had learned to associate with serious cases. He took one look at Whiskers and immediately began preparing for more extensive testing. "The blood work from yesterday shows elevated liver enzymes and signs of neurological distress," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "I need to be honest with you, Nina. These symptoms are consistent with poisoning, specifically something that affects the nervous system and liver function simultaneously." The words hit Nina like a physical blow, even though she'd been preparing herself for this possibility since yesterday. Hearing it confirmed by someone she trusted professionally made it impossible to dismiss as paranoia or coincidence. "What kind of poison?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are several possibilities, but given the symptom progression, I suspect either ethylene glycol, antifreeze, or possibly one of the newer rodenticides that contain neurotoxins. Both are readily available, both would produce these symptoms, and both—" He paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "Both what?" "Both would require deliberate administration. These aren't substances a cat would encounter accidentally, especially an indoor cat like Whiskers." Nina felt the world tilt slightly, her worst fears crystallizing into medical reality. Someone had deliberately poisoned her cat, the one living being who had never judged her, never criticized her choices, never made her feel inadequate or unwelcome. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. "Can you save him?" she asked, though she was terrified of the answer. "We're going to try everything," Dr. Martinez promised. "I'm starting him on supportive care immediately. IV fluids, liver protectants, anti-seizure medication. The next 24 hours will be critical." Nina spent the morning at the clinic, alternating between sitting with Whiskers in the intensive care unit and pacing the hallways like a caged animal. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts from Marcus, who was stuck at a crucial project meeting but promised to come as soon as he could get away. Around noon, Nina forced herself to leave Whiskers in Dr. Martinez's capable hands and drive to Eleanor's house for their scheduled clearing the air conversation. Every fiber of her being rebelled against leaving Whiskers when he was so sick, but she knew this confrontation could no longer be avoided. Eleanor answered the door wearing a flowing summer dress in pale yellow, her appearance as perfectly curated as always, despite the oppressive heat. Her smile was warm and welcoming, the picture of a concerned future mother-in-law eager to resolve misunderstandings. "Nina, dear, you look exhausted," Eleanor said, ushering her into the blessed coolness of the air-conditioned house. "I hope you're not coming down with something. This heat is just brutal, isn't it?" The living room had been prepared for their meeting with obvious care. Fresh flowers on the coffee table, a pitcher of iced tea with mint leaves floating on top, and small pastries arranged on Eleanor's best china. It was the kind of thoughtful hospitality that would have touched Nina under normal circumstances. "Thank you for agreeing to talk," Nina said, settling into the chair Eleanor indicated. "I know things have been tense between us, and I want to find a way to move forward." "Of course, dear," Eleanor replied, pouring tea with practiced grace. "I've been so concerned about the misunderstanding yesterday. Marcus seemed to think I'd said something hurtful, but honestly, I was just expressing the natural concerns any mother would have about her son's future." Nina accepted the tea, but didn't drink it, her hands wrapped around the glass more for something to hold than for refreshment. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer." "Certainly, dear. I believe in being direct." "My cat is very sick, critically sick, according to my veterinarian. The symptoms appeared right after our lunch yesterday, and Dr. Martinez believes Whiskers has been poisoned." Nina watched Eleanor's face very carefully as she spoke, looking for any flicker of guilt or knowledge.
Eleanor's expression shifted to one of genuine seeming concern, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of dismay. "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. The poor little thing. What kind of poison? Do they know how it happened?" "They think it might be antifreeze or a rodenticide, something that would have to be given deliberately." Nina's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding so hard she was sure Eleanor could hear it. "Deliberately?" Eleanor's shock appeared authentic, her face paling slightly. "You mean someone intentionally hurt your cat? Who would do such a horrible thing?" The performance was flawless, but Nina caught something in Eleanor's eyes, a brief flash of what might have been satisfaction before the mask of concern slipped back into place. It was gone so quickly that Nina almost doubted she'd seen it, but the moment crystallized her suspicions into certainty. "I don't know," Nina said carefully, "but the timing is suspicious. Whiskers was fine until yesterday, and the only new person he's been exposed to recently is you." Eleanor's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Are you suggesting that I poisoned your cat, Nina? Because that's quite an accusation to make without any evidence." "I'm not suggesting anything," Nina replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. "I'm just trying to understand how a healthy indoor cat suddenly develops symptoms of severe poisoning." "Well, I certainly hope you're not implying that I had anything to do with it. I may not be particularly fond of cats, but I would never harm an innocent animal. The very suggestion is rather insulting, don't you think?" The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, a careful dance of accusation and denial that left Nina feeling frustrated and helpless. Eleanor maintained her pose of injured innocence throughout, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and expressing horror that anyone could think her capable of such cruelty. But Nina noticed other things too, the way Eleanor's hands remained perfectly steady despite her emotional display, the calculated pauses before each response, and most tellingly, the complete absence of questions about Whiskers' condition or prognosis. A truly innocent person would have asked about treatment options, recovery chances, or what they could do to help. Eleanor asked none of these questions. When Nina finally left, she felt more certain than ever that Eleanor was responsible for Whiskers' condition, but she also realized how difficult it would be to prove. Eleanor was far too smart to leave obvious evidence, and her performance of wounded innocence was masterful. Without concrete proof, any accusations would make Nina look paranoid and vindictive.
Back at the clinic, Whiskers' condition had stabilized, but not improved. Dr. Martinez explained that they were essentially buying time, supporting his body's systems while hoping the poison worked its way out of his system. The next few days would determine whether the damage was reversible. Marcus arrived around 6 o'clock, still wearing his work clothes and looking haggard with worry. He'd gotten Nina's text about the confrontation with his mother, and his face was grim as he listened to her recount the conversation. "She's lying," he said flatly when Nina finished. "I've known my mother for 28 years, and I can tell when she's lying. The question is, how do we prove it?" "I don't know if we can. She's too careful, too smart. And even if we could prove she did it, what then? Do we call the police? Press charges? Destroy your relationship with your mother forever?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching Whiskers sleep fitfully in his oxygen-enriched kennel. "My relationship with my mother was destroyed the moment she decided to poison your cat. The question is whether we let her get away with it." That night, Nina made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't prove Eleanor's guilt through conventional means, but she could document what was happening, gather evidence, and prepare for whatever came next. She started a detailed journal of events, took photographs of Whiskers' condition, and began researching her legal options. She also did something else, something that felt both desperate and necessary. She installed a small security camera in her apartment, hidden where it could monitor the main living area without being obvious. If Eleanor tried to escalate her campaign against Whiskers, Nina wanted to be ready. Because deep in her heart, Nina knew this wasn't over. Eleanor had made her position clear. She saw Whiskers as an obstacle to her son's future, and she was willing to eliminate obstacles by any means necessary. The only question was what she would try next, and whether Nina would be ready for it. As she fell asleep that night on the couch next to Whiskers' travel carrier, she found herself thinking about warfare. Not the dramatic, explosive kind depicted in movies, but the quiet, insidious kind fought in living rooms and family dinners, where the weapons were smiles and poisoned cats, and the casualties were measured in broken trust and shattered innocence. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no going back.
Friday brought the first sign of hope in what felt like a lifetime of darkness. Whiskers lifted his head as Nina entered the clinic's intensive care unit, and his eyes tracked her movement across the room. Small improvements, but monumental after watching him slip further away each day. Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic, explaining that Whiskers' liver function had stabilized and his neurological responses were slowly improving. "He's fighting," Dr. Martinez said, adjusting the IV drip that had been keeping Whiskers alive. "Cats are remarkably resilient creatures, and he's young and strong. If we can keep supporting his systems for another few days, he might pull through this completely." Nina felt tears of relief spring to her eyes, the first positive emotions she'd experienced since this nightmare began. She spent an hour sitting beside Whiskers' kennel, talking softly to him, and watching him respond to her voice with increasingly alert expressions. But even as hope began to return regarding Whiskers' recovery, Nina's anger about Eleanor's actions was crystallizing into something harder and more determined than she'd ever felt before. She'd spent the previous evening researching animal cruelty laws in Arizona, consulting online legal forums, and mapping out exactly what evidence she would need to build a case against Eleanor. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Nina was at home Saturday morning, reviewing the security footage from her hidden camera and preparing to return to the clinic when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Is this Nina Thomas?" asked a woman's voice, elderly but sharp with intelligence. "Yes, this is Nina." "My name is Margaret Chen. I live next door to Eleanor Williams, and I understand you're dating her son, Marcus." Nina's pulse quickened. She'd never met Eleanor's neighbors, but Marcus had mentioned them occasionally, retired professionals who kept to themselves, but maintained friendly relationships with the families on their street. "Yes, that's right. May I ask how you got my number?" "I have my ways," Margaret said with a dry chuckle. "Listen, dear, I'm calling because I think you should know something about what's been happening at Eleanor's house this week. Something that might interest you, given what I've heard about your cat." Nina nearly dropped the phone. "What do you mean?"
I was working in my garden Tuesday evening when I saw Eleanor in her backyard doing something very strange. She was crushing up pills with a mortar and pestle, the kind of heavy-duty pharmacy equipment she has from her years in pharmaceutical sales. When she finished, she mixed the powder into what looked like cat treats. The words hit Nina like lightning. After days of suspicion and circumstantial evidence, here was an eyewitness account of Eleanor preparing what could only have been the poison that nearly killed Whiskers. "Are you certain it was Tuesday evening?" Nina asked, her voice barely steady. "Absolutely certain. I remember because my husband and I were discussing how odd it was. Eleanor has never owned cats, and she's made no secret of her dislike for them. We couldn't understand why she would be preparing cat treats, especially with such an elaborate setup. Did you see what kind of pills she was crushing?" "I couldn't tell from my yard, but I did notice she was wearing gloves and being very careful about cleanup afterward. She disposed of everything in a trash bag that she took directly to her car rather than putting it in her regular garbage." Nina's mind raced. Eleanor had prepared the poison Tuesday evening, and Wednesday was when she'd brought lunch for Nina and Marcus, lunch that had included several dishes Nina might have taken home for leftovers for later, along with what could have been poison treats disguised as a peace offering. "Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to tell this to the police? What you saw could be evidence in a criminal case." There was a pause. "Dear, I'm 83 years old, and I've lived long enough to know the difference between neighborhood gossip and something that could save an innocent animal's life. Of course I'll talk to the police." Nina's hands were shaking as she ended the call and immediately dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense with the strain of the past few days. "Nina? How's Whiskers this morning?" "He's improving, thank God. But Nina, I just got a call from your mother's neighbor. She saw Eleanor preparing what sounds like poisoned cat treats Tuesday evening." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Nina wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was hollow with the pain she'd never heard before. "Tuesday evening, the night before she invited us over for lunch." He paused, processing the timeline. "She planned this, Nina. She deliberately lured us over so she could find a way to poison Whiskers. This wasn't some impulsive moment of anger. It was premeditated." Margaret Chen is willing to talk to the police. She saw the whole thing. Eleanor crushing pills, mixing them with cat treats, disposing of the evidence carefully. "It's exactly the kind of testimony we need." "Then we call them," Marcus said without hesitation. "Today. Right now. I don't care what this does to my family or my relationship with my mother. She tried to kill your cat, Nina. She could have succeeded."
Nina felt a surge of love for Marcus that was almost overwhelming. She'd been afraid that when it came down to choosing between his mother and her, he might waver or ask her to find some way to handle this privately. Instead, he was ready to pursue justice, regardless of the personal cost. "There's something else," Nina said. "I want to set a trap for her. With Mrs. Chen's testimony, we have enough to file charges, but Eleanor is smart enough to lawyer up immediately. She'll claim the neighbor is mistaken, that it's a case of mistaken identity or misunderstood actions." "What kind of trap?" "I want to give her another opportunity to try something, but this time we'll be ready with cameras, witnesses, and evidence that even she can't explain away." The plan they developed was risky, but elegant in its simplicity. Nina would call Eleanor and tell her that Whiskers had died during the night, that she was devastated and needed support from family. She would ask Eleanor to come over to help her deal with the arrangements, creating an opportunity for Eleanor to either confess or attempt to dispose of evidence. Marcus would be hidden in the apartment with a camera, while Mrs. Chen would be positioned to observe Eleanor's arrival and departure. If Eleanor brought anything suspicious or said anything incriminating, they would have multiple witnesses and recordings. "She'll probably be smart enough not to confess," Marcus warned, "but her reaction to the news that Whiskers is dead might reveal something. And if she brought more poison with her, planning to use Whiskers' supposed death as cover for disposing of evidence, then we'll have her," Nina finished. That afternoon, Nina made the call. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, her voice broken with grief as she told Eleanor that Whiskers had taken a turn for the worse during the night and hadn't survived. Eleanor's response was immediate. and revealing. Instead of offering condolences or asking about what had happened, her first question was about the body. "Oh, dear, that's terrible news," Eleanor said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but terrible. "What are you planning to do about the remains? I imagine you'll want to have them cremated or something." "I don't know," Nina sobbed convincingly. "I can't think straight right now. I just feel so lost." "Of course, dear. These things are always difficult. Would you like to come over? I could help you figure out the practical arrangements. It's important to handle these situations quickly, especially in this heat." The eagerness in Eleanor's voice was unmistakable. She was volunteering to help dispose of evidence that she believed would eliminate any chance of proving her guilt. "Would you? That would be so helpful. I just don't know what to do." "I'll be right over. And Nina, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know how attached you were to that cat." As Nina hung up the phone, she realized that Eleanor had made her first critical mistake. A truly innocent person would have expressed shock at the sudden death, asked about symptoms or what the veterinarian had said. Eleanor had done none of those things, instead focusing immediately on disposal and cleanup. Marcus was already setting up the recording equipment when Nina finished the call. They had perhaps 30 minutes before Eleanor arrived. 30 minutes to prepare a trap that would finally expose her for what she really was. "Whatever happens," Marcus said, checking the camera angles one final time, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you for fighting back. A lot of people would have just accepted that Whiskers died and tried to move on. She tried to kill him because she knew how much I loved him. That kind of cruelty doesn't get a free pass, no matter who she is or how much she means to you." As they waited for Eleanor to arrive, Nina felt something she hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. A sense of power and control. For days, she'd been reacting to Eleanor's attacks, always one step behind, always defending rather than pursuing. But now, for the first time, Eleanor was walking into a situation that Nina had designed. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Nina intended to make sure that Eleanor's mask finally slipped completely, on camera, with witnesses, in a way that even the most skilled manipulation couldn't explain away. Eleanor arrived exactly 23 minutes after Nina's phone call, carrying a large designer handbag and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression that looked practiced in a mirror. She'd changed into darker clothes, navy slacks and a charcoal blouse, as if she'd consciously dressed for a morning visit. But Nina noticed her steps were too quick, her movements too eager for someone genuinely coming to comfort a grieving pet owner. "Oh, your poor dear," Eleanor said as Nina opened the door, her arms immediately reaching out for an embrace that felt as cold as it looked warm. "I came as quickly as I could. Have you been crying all morning?" Nina allowed herself to be hugged, noting how Eleanor's eyes immediately began scanning the apartment over her shoulder, clearly looking for signs of Whiskers' body or evidence of what had happened during the night. "I can't stop crying," Nina managed, her voice thick with manufactured grief. "He was everything to me, and now he's just gone." "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked, pulling back from the embrace with what appeared to be gentle concern. "The poor little thing. Did it happen at the veterinary clinic, or did you bring him home?" The question confirmed what Nina had suspected. Eleanor was fishing for information about where the body was and whether there might be evidence from a necropsy. A truly innocent person would have asked how Whiskers died, whether he suffered, or what the veterinarian had said about the cause. Eleanor's focus on logistics was damning. "I couldn't be here, so Dr. Martinez said they need to keep him until Monday for paperwork and things. I don't really understand all the procedures." "Of course, dear. These things can be complicated." Eleanor settled into the same chair she had occupied during their confrontational lunch earlier in the week, but her posture was different now, more relaxed, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I'm sure Dr. Martinez will handle everything properly."
Nina sat across from her, close enough to the hidden camera that every micro-expression would be captured clearly. Eleanor, can I ask you something? As someone who worked in pharmaceutical sales for so many years. Certainly, dear. What is it? Dr. Martinez thinks Whiskers might have been poisoned. He mentioned antifreeze or something called a rodenticide. Nina watched Eleanor's face carefully as she spoke. Do you know anything about those kinds of poisons? How someone might have gotten access to them? For just a moment, less than a second, Eleanor's mask slipped completely. Nina saw a flash of satisfaction cross her features, quickly followed by what looked like relief. Then the concerned expression snapped back into place, but it was too late. The camera had captured everything. Poisoned? How terrible! Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false horror. Though I suppose it's not entirely surprising. These apartment complexes aren't always careful about pest control. Someone probably put out rat poison, and poor Whiskers got into it somehow. But he was an indoor cat. He never went outside, never had access to anything like that. Oh, you'd be surprised how these things can happen. Poison can be tracked in on shoes, carried by other animals, even blown in through windows. It's more common than people think. The explanation was smooth and plausible, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd clearly thought through this conversation in advance. But Eleanor had made another crucial mistake. She demonstrated detailed knowledge about how poisoning could occur, while simultaneously claiming ignorance about the specific toxins involved. The strange thing is, Nina continued, Dr. Martinez said Whiskers looked like deliberate, like someone had mixed the poison into food specifically designed to appeal to cats. This time, Eleanor's reaction was even more telling. Instead of shock or outrage at the suggestion that someone had deliberately targeted Whiskers, she immediately went on the defensive. Well, I certainly hope you're not suggesting that anyone in Marcus's family would do such a thing. That would be a very serious accusation to make without proof. I didn't mention Marcus's family. I just said Dr. Martinez thought it looked deliberate. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, realizing she had revealed more than she intended. But she was too committed to her performance to back down now. Of course you didn't, dear. I just know how grief can make people look for someone to blame. It's natural to want answers when something terrible happens to someone we love. At that moment, Eleanor made her final and most damaging mistake. She reached into her large handbag and pulled out a small plastic container filled with what looked like cat treats. I actually brought these for Whiskers. I felt so terrible about our conversation the other day, about the things I said about pets and relationships. I wanted to make peace with him, to show you that I could accept him as part of our family. Nina stared at the container, her heart pounding. Eleanor had just provided the final piece of evidence they needed. She had brought what were almost certainly poisoned treats to an apartment where she believed there was a dead cat, supposedly to make peace with an animal she claimed to want to accept. That's very thoughtful, Nina managed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Though I'm curious, when did you buy these? Whiskers had very specific dietary needs because of his sensitive stomach. I picked them up yesterday afternoon from that pet store near the mall. The clerk said they were very popular with cats. Another lie. Easily verifiable and devastating to her credibility. No pet store clerk would recommend random treats for a cat with dietary sensitivities. And Eleanor had just admitted to purchasing cat treats the day after she made her feelings about Whiskers abundantly clear. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Whiskers isn't dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked very much like panic. What do you mean? She asked, her carefully modulated voice cracking slightly. I mean he's alive,
recovering at the veterinary clinic under Dr. Martinez's care. He was poisoned, just like I said, but he's going to survive. Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. The mask of concerned mother-in-law fell away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "You lied to me," she said, her voice hard with anger. "You deliberately deceived me into coming here under false pretenses." "Yes, I did. Just like you deliberately poisoned my cat. The only difference is that my deception didn't almost kill an innocent animal."
Eleanor stood abruptly, clutching her handbag as if it contained something precious. "I don't have to listen to these accusations. You have no proof of anything, and these wild theories make you sound mentally unstable." "Actually, we have quite a bit of proof," Nina said, standing as well. At that moment, Marcus emerged from his hiding place, camera in hand, while Margaret Shen appeared in the doorway. She'd been watching from the hallway and had entered when she heard Eleanor's voice rising. "We have Mrs. Chen's eyewitness testimony about you preparing poison Tuesday night," Nina continued. "We have recordings of this entire conversation, including your admission that you bought cat treats yesterday specifically for a cat you claim to dislike. And we have the treats you just tried to give me, which I'm betting will test positive for the same toxins that nearly killed Whiskers." Eleanor looked around the room like a trapped animal, her eyes darting between Marcus's disappointed face, Mrs. Chen's stern expression, and Nina's unwavering gaze. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "That cat was destroying my son's future. He was spending all his time here, all his money on veterinary bills and pet supplies. He was talking about marriage, about children, but how could he be a proper father when he was obsessing over some woman's cat?" The confession spilled out of her in a torrent of justification and self-pity. "I gave him the best years of my life, raised him to be successful and responsible, and he was throwing it all away for some girl who cared more about animals than building a real family." Marcus stepped forward, his face pale with shock and disgust. "Mom, you tried to kill an innocent animal because you couldn't control my life? You poisoned Nina's cat because you couldn't accept that I'm an adult who makes his own decisions." "I was protecting you," Eleanor screamed, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "From her, from that lifestyle, from a future of being second place to a house full of pets." The sound that came from Eleanor when she realized what she admitted was like nothing Nina had ever heard, a wail of rage and defeat that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. It was the sound of someone who had built their entire identity around control and manipulation, watching that power crumble in real time. At that moment, the police arrived. Marcus had called them during Eleanor's confession, and they'd been waiting outside for Nina's signal. Detective Sarah Rodriguez took Eleanor's statement while her partner collected the evidence, including the container of treats that would later test positive for the same neurotoxic rodenticide that had nearly killed Whiskers. Eleanor was charged with animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, and attempted poisoning. The case made local news when it went to trial 6 months later, partly because of Eleanor's background in pharmaceutical sales, and partly because of the shocking nature of a mother-in-law poisoning her son's girlfriend's pet. During the trial, additional evidence emerged. Investigators found Eleanor's internet search history, showing extensive research into cat-safe poisons, her credit card records revealing purchases of rodenticide from 3 different stores, and her phone records showing calls to veterinary clinics asking about symptoms of various types of poisoning. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. But the most satisfying moment for Nina came not in the courtroom, but 3 months after Eleanor's arrest, when Whiskers fully recovered and celebrated by bringing Nina a catnip mouse he'd caught and killed with particular enthusiasm. He'd regained all his weight, his coat was lustrous orange again, and his eyes were bright with the intelligence and affection that had nearly been stolen from the world forever. Marcus and Nina were married the following spring in a small ceremony at the Botanical Garden, with Whiskers serving as ring-bearer, a role he performed with dignity, despite his obvious boredom with the proceedings. Eleanor was serving an 18-month sentence and was prohibited from contacting any of them, a restriction she violated exactly once with a letter that was immediately turned over to authorities.
Standing at their kitchen window on their first anniversary, watching Whiskers chase shadows in their new backyard, Nina reflected on how much had changed since that terrible week when she'd almost lost everything she held dear. She had learned that evil could wear a perfect smile and offer poisoned treats disguised as peace offerings. She had learned that justice, when it finally came, really did sound like the screams of someone who thought they'd never get caught. Most importantly, she had learned that love, real love, meant standing up to monsters, even when those monsters came wearing the face of family. Marcus had chosen her and Whiskers over his mother's manipulation, and together they'd built something stronger than Eleanor's toxicity could ever destroy. Sometimes late at night, when Whiskers was purring against her chest and Marcus was sleeping peacefully beside her, Nina would remember Eleanor's final scream of rage and defeat. It had been music then, and it was music still. The sound of justice served and innocence protected, echoing through their dreams like a lullaby.
2 years after Eleanor Williams was sentenced to prison, Nita Thomas Williams stood in the doorway of her new veterinary clinic, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the polished floors. The brass nameplate beside the entrance read, "Whiskers Memorial Animal Hospital," a tribute to the cat who had survived an attempt on his life and inspired Nina's transformation from receptionist to licensed veterinary technician to clinic owner. The journey to this moment had been longer and more complex than Nina ever imagined when she first discovered Whiskers convulsing on her kitchen floor. What had started as a personal tragedy had evolved into something much larger, a mission to protect other animals and families from the kind of cruelty that had nearly destroyed her own life. Dr. Martinez had been her mentor throughout veterinary technician school, encouraging her to pursue advanced training in toxicology and emergency care. "You have a gift for recognizing when something isn't quite right," he'd told her during her final practicum. "That instinct, combined with your technical skills, could save a lot of lives." He'd been right. In the 18 months since earning her certification, Nina had identified 3 separate cases of suspected animal poisoning that other clinics had missed. 2 involved vindictive neighbors using antifreeze-laced treats, and 1 was a case of deliberate chocolate poisoning by an ex-boyfriend seeking revenge against his former partner. Each case had reminded Nina of her own experience with Eleanor, but instead of triggering trauma, these situations had given her purpose. The new clinic was small but state-of-the-art, equipped with the latest diagnostic technology and a specialized toxicology lab that could identify poison cases within hours rather than days. Nina had used part of the settlement money from Eleanor's civil lawsuit to fund the advanced equipment, turning her personal nightmare into a resource for other pet owners facing similar crises. Marcus had been her partner in every sense throughout the process. He'd left his construction job to become the clinic's business manager, applying his project management skills to the complex logistics of running a veterinary practice. His transformation had been as dramatic as Nina's. The easygoing man who once dismissed family tensions as minor disagreements had become a fierce advocate for both animal welfare and survivor rights. "You saved more than Whiskers," he'd told Nina on the day they signed the lease for the clinic space. "You saved every animal that will walk through these doors, and every family that won't have to go through what we went through." The clinic's grand opening had drawn unexpected media attention. The local news station had run a feature story about Nina's journey from victim to advocate, and the response had been overwhelming. Pet owners from across Arizona had called to schedule appointments, many specifically requesting Nina's expertise for cases involving suspicious symptoms or suspected poisoning. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from Margaret Chen, Eleanor's former neighbor who had become an unlikely friend and supporter. Now 85 and still sharp as a blade, Margaret had volunteered to help with the clinic's community outreach program, teaching pet owners how to recognize signs of deliberate poisoning and what steps to take if they suspected foul play. "Evil people count on good people being too polite to fight back," Margaret often told the groups she addressed. "But sometimes being polite means letting innocent creatures suffer."
sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to be silent. Whiskers himself had become something of a celebrity in the veterinary community. Now 6 years old and completely recovered from his poisoning, he served as the clinic's unofficial mascot and therapy cat. His presence seemed to calm anxious animals and worried owners alike, as if he understood that his survival represented hope for others facing similar crises. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a veterinary behaviorist who had joined Nina's team 6 months earlier, often marveled at Whiskers' intuitive understanding of his role. It's like he knows he's a survivor. He gravitates toward the sickest animals and the most frightened owners. I've never seen anything quite like it. Nina had also become involved in legislative advocacy, working with state representatives to strengthen Arizona's animal cruelty laws. The Whiskers Protection Act, which she had helped draft, increased penalties for deliberate animal poisoning and established mandatory reporting requirements for veterinarians who suspected intentional harm. The legislation had faced opposition from some quarters, people who argued that family disputes shouldn't be criminalized or that the penalties were too harsh for property crimes. But Nina's testimony during the legislative hearings had been compelling, particularly when she had brought Whiskers with her to demonstrate the lasting effects of severe poisoning. This isn't about property, she had told the legislative committee, Whiskers purring quietly in her lap. This is about weaponizing cruelty against innocent beings to control and manipulate human relationships. When someone poisons a beloved pet, they're not just attacking an animal, they're attacking the emotional core of a family. The act had passed unanimously and been signed into law the previous spring. Nina kept a framed copy of the legislation in her office next to a photograph of Whiskers on the day he'd come home from his recovery at Dr. Martinez's clinic. Eleanor's impact on their lives had extended far beyond the initial poisoning incident. During her trial, additional victims had come forward, other women who had dated Eleanor's sons over the years, reporting mysterious illnesses in their pets, damaged personal property, and campaigns of psychological harassment that had driven several relationships to their breaking point. The pattern had been consistent. Eleanor would identify whatever her sons' girlfriends valued most, pets, career achievements, family relationships, and systematically attack those foundations until the relationships crumbled. Nina had been the first to fight back effectively, the first to gather evidence and pursue legal consequences.
She turned cruelty into an art form, the prosecutor had said during closing arguments. But art requires an audience, and Nina Thomas refused to be a passive observer to her own destruction. Eleanor had served 14 months of her 18-month sentence before being released on parole. The conditions of her release prohibited contact with Nina, Marcus, or any member of their extended circle, including Dr. Martinez and the staff at both veterinary clinics. She'd been required to undergo psychological counseling and perform community service at an animal shelter, a punishment that Nina had initially thought was poetic justice, but later realized might be problematic for the animals in Eleanor's care. Marcus had struggled with his mother's conviction and imprisonment more than he'd initially admitted. Despite everything Eleanor had done, she was still his mother, and her transformation from protective parent to convicted criminal had forced him to reevaluate his entire childhood and family history. I keep thinking about all the girlfriends I had in high school and college who just disappeared. Girls who said my family was too intense or that my mom made them uncomfortable. I always thought they were being dramatic, but now I wonder what my mother did to them that I never saw. Therapy had helped both Nina and Marcus process the trauma and betrayal they'd experienced. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, their couples counselor, had specialized in families affected by narcissistic abuse and had helped them understand that Eleanor's behavior represented a pattern of psychological manipulation that extended far beyond the poisoning incident. Poisoning Whiskers was an escalation, not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a control strategy that had been working for years through more subtle means, Dr. Walsh had explained. The healing process had strengthened Nina and Marcus's relationship in unexpected ways.
They'd learned to communicate more directly, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong, and to prioritize their chosen family over biological obligations that came with toxic conditions. Their wedding had been a celebration not just of their love for each other, but of their survival and growth through an ordeal that could have destroyed them. Instead of traditional vows, they'd written promises that reflected their journey, to protect each other from those who would harm them, to speak truth even when it was difficult, and to never let anyone use love as a weapon against them. Standing in her clinic on this quiet morning, Nina reflected on how much had changed since that terrible week when she'd almost lost Whiskers. She'd discovered reserves of strength and determination she'd never known she possessed. She'd learned that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. Most importantly, she'd found her true calling in protecting other animals and families from the kind of cruelty that had nearly destroyed her own life. Whiskers appeared at her feet, winding around her legs with the contented purr that had become the soundtrack of her new life. At 6 years old, he was in his prime, healthy, confident, and completely recovered from his brush with death. His survival had been the foundation for everything that followed, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope could triumph over hatred. "Ready for another day, buddy?" Nina asked, scratching behind his ears as the first clients began arriving for their appointments. As if in response, Whiskers trotted toward the examination rooms, his tail held high like a flag of victory. He knew his job, and he took it seriously, greeting anxious pets, comforting worried owners, and serving as a living proof that even the worst cruelty could be overcome with love, determination, and the courage to fight back. Nina followed him into the clinic, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. She'd learned that evil often wore familiar faces and offered poisoned gifts disguised as peace offerings. But she'd also learned that good people, when they finally decided to stop being polite and start being brave, could accomplish extraordinary things. The morning sun streamed through the clinic windows, casting everything in golden light. A new day, full of possibilities, in a life built on the foundation of justice served and innocence protected. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible but unmistakably present, was the echo of Eleanor Williams' final scream of defeat. Still music to Nina's ears. Still the sweetest sound she'd ever heard.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.